Well, welcome to today's extra special episode of Wesley Live. I am just thrilled to have two special guests with us today. We have Dr. Patrick Eby with Wesley Seminary with us, of course, and then we have Pastor Chris McFadden from Lakin, Kansas with us. How are you gentlemen doing today?
Doing well, thanks.
Doing great. Thanks a lot, Joel.
Oh, you're welcome. So before we get started, Chris, you are a student in our D-Men program, correct?
That's right.
And you, how's your arm doing, if you don't mind me asking?
It's doing better. Yeah, I took a fall in October and fractured my left humerus, which is not funny, in a couple places. And so, yeah, it's doing a lot better. We're getting stronger. Thanks for asking.
Excellent, excellent. And then how's the new baby? Got to ask that.
Yeah, we have Eleanor Grace, 5 months old, and she's popped a tooth and a half out already. So she's working hard on that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's good to see you. You look like you're doing well. And again, I have asked Chris and Patrick on today, and they have a topic they'd like to discuss. So, gentlemen, I'm just going to turn it over to you now.
Well, it's good to be here with Chris. Chris and I go back to my beginning days at the seminary. He was in my first spiritual formation cohort, and he's a glutton for punishment because he's continued to take classes with me. But one that we took most recently was one on lyrical theology. And what we want to talk about a little bit is how lyrical theology might help us think about some of the challenges that we're facing today. How would that be different than maybe some of the other ways that we handle conflict or the COVID-19 suffering? How would it look at it through poetry and music instead of looking through it as a prose and a systematic type of theology? So that's kind of what we look through lyrical theology. And I'll just throw it over to you, Chris. What is lyrical theology? How does it function differently than systematic theology and some of the other boxes that we might talk about theology?
Right. Yeah. I was first introduced to the concept of lyrical theology, actually, just in talking with you, Dr. Eby, and having conversations and like unearthing interesting Charles Wesley pieces as we began to form a friendship in seminary. And really the way I kind of understood lyrical theology was that you have certain containers of theological boxes that we might put different disciplines of theology in, like you said, systematic or practical, historical, biblical, whatever you want to say. And lyrical theology is one of those containers we might put it in. And it specifically seeks to look at the content, the theological content of the songs that we sing in church, the poetry we inhabit and engage with in church. And what we're not talking about too is important is we're not talking about worship wars, right? Like this is not about the form, like traditional hymns are better than modern praise choruses or what have you. That's not what lyrical theology is as concerned about. It's concerned about how what we are singing is forming us. There's a formative value to the way we express our faith through song. So I was thinking like how songs get into your bloodstream, they become part of you. And when you're happy or you're sad, when you're at peace, when you're stressed, you turn to different songs that naturally come out of your heart, and you remember lyrics. And I've recalled lyrics, I know, in the past when I've been in situations. Sometimes they're worship songs, sometimes they're from other mediums, but they kind of reconcile or give language to how I'm feeling in the moment. So I think that the songs that we sing have a formative function, a theological value, and that's where lyrical theology kind of comes into play. And since we're Wesleyans, we have a unique opportunity we have a pair of prolific lyrical theologians in our past that give us our namesake, John and Charles Wesley. I think Charles was more prolific than John in that regard, but there's a lot of value into going back and studying their body of work, their hymnody. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about not only just looking at the lyrical theology of John and Charles and others, but actually using lyrical theology as a way of expressing your own faith? So writing your own poetry and songs.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a big, it seems like there's a common or a cultural movement to do a lot more journaling and whatnot. And people talk about writing their prayers out. That's become sort of a resurgence now. And I think there's a lot of depth to mine in our own lyrical theology and how we practice that, to recognizing there's value there. It's not just for our own benefit, or it's not just cutesy or something. There's value. There's formative value in even our own lyrical theology. Yeah.
Good. So, what kind of value is there to studying old hymns and poems or new hymns and poems? And what does that have to offer the church at large or ministry leaders?
So that's what I think really fascinated me about lyrical theology. And I'll say Charles Wesley's stuff in particular, as I've been drawn to him. I've told you before, Dr. Eby, that I feel a kindred spirit with him a lot at times when I'm reading through his poems and his hymns. And so in some disciplines of theology, there is a pressure to get it right. Like, for example, you want to have all your theological ducks lined up in a row.
Yeah.
Because maybe in like systematic theology, you're producing a document that you're going to stand on as a conviction, and you're trying to really work that out. And that's totally fine. I don't want to talk bad about that. But what I want to say about lyrical theology is there's a unique space in lyrical theology to wrestle with tension, I think. There's like this sandbox, and you can kind of get in there and you can wrestle with different tensions, and there's not a deadline, or there's not an end product requiring you to put your feet down, land the plane right here, and be specific about that. I think that there's an example of this, for example, in one of Charles's hymns, in the Hymns for the Resurrection of Our Lord, which is one of my favorite hymnals of his. I studied that in detail. He says, perfect love, if it can even be. He has a question mark there. Now, if you know about John and Charles, you know that here's John on the other spectrum, who is really hammering out the doctrine of Christian perfection and how important that was in his own formation. And here's Charles kind of saying, yeah, I'm with you, John, but I've got questions, right? There's tension there for me. So I think that's really kind of a cool way you can find space in lyrical theology to work these things out without the imminent fear of being, I got to be right, I got to get this right now. So for ministry leaders, I think lyrical theology gives us a chance to work out some of these tensions in our faith in a way that's safe, in a non-pressured space. And then we can share that with our congregation. It's awesome to take off the hat of authority sometimes, and just to rest in the fact, like, I'm wrestling with this. Let me share some poems and some hymns that really speak to where I'm at. And then our people, when we do that, the people we minister to, they get the freedom to do the same thing. And it's about releasing some of that tension and allowing people to work freely through those issues.
Yeah. Have you read enough of Charles's work that you can see the difference between when he writes out of his experience and when he writes to express a doctrinal belief? Or do I need to say something about that?
No, I think that I have seen some threads in there, but I'd like to hear what you would say.
So one of the things I've looked at is he was asked to kind of task writing to women who had lost children in childbirth or early, and when he was tasked with it, he had a kind of suck it up type of attitude. And then unfortunately, him and his wife lost 5 children.
Oh no. And
it wasn't a suck it up attitude anymore. It was like, how will I ever overcome the suffering that I have? So like, the lyrical theology allows you to write out of the experience of suffering, the experience of whatever it is that is going on in your life. And if you write out of the experience, it's so much richer. And people can tell that you've experienced, the tragedy that you're writing about. At least, I mean, it's night and day in Charles. For me, what happens before he's lost a child and what happens as he's losing his own children. Wow. It's just night and day. So that brings us maybe to the question that everybody seems to be asking today. Right now, in this time of this virus, this pandemic, does Charles have anything in his work to speak about our cultural moment?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. The point you just brought up is so rich. I want to come back to that in just a second. But I do want to share a little bit about how kind of I got into this seat. And part of that is that as you mentioned, Dr. E, that you had conducted an independent study for me a few years ago when I was finishing up my MDiv at Wesley. And I really liked the format that was available to me. I was able to not specialize in the MDiv, which left my elective slots free. So I kind of got to pick and choose what I wanted to take. And what's cool about Wesley is when you're doing that, if you have an interest that's not covered in the elective catalog, you can go to a professor and kind of pitch an idea. Say, hey, I'd like to study this. I like looking at this person or this whatever. And I approached you about lyrical theology, and you had already had a seed for a class in mind for that, and thought we'd kind of like test it out and play it out. And that was a great, great class. And out of that class, you encouraged me to take the work I did in that class and take it and submit a paper to a theological conference. I was terrified. I didn't have confidence, but I did it. And that blossomed into getting to present at that conference, which was a blast. And then from that, you invited me to join you in some work in commenting on one of Charles's hymns in specific, which is Jesu, Lover of My Soul. And so all that to kind of encourage those that are listening, like there are opportunities within the system to really branch out and do stuff that you're not sure you could do, or you never know you had the chance to do. And that was a blast. But by the way, a quick question back at you, Dr. Eby, why Jesu? My wife asked me this the other day when I was reading some to her. She says, why Jesu? Why Jesu instead of Jesus?
Yeah. I think it's Jesu because of the poetic meter and kind of the emphasis. So there's a real strict meter to the way these things have to be, a long stress, short stress. So if to follow the pattern, Jesus is different than Jesu.
Yeah.
So like which one of those fits better in it? And I think this would be more of a Latinized way of saying it. I didn't look that up, even though I knew the question was coming. So that's my best guess.
Hey, I'm convinced. Sounds good to me.
I'm not.
Well, in this specific hymn that you and I did that work with, what you were talking about, experience, comes directly into play for Charles here, because he's wrestling with attention. He's taking attention with fear and dread and suffering, and wrestling with that against joy and release and forgiveness. But there's a backdrop of water here, and as you noted in our article in our chapter together, that he's recalling these choppy voyages across the Atlantic, which he speaks very candidly about being terrifying. He talks about his prayers not being heard, like he didn't understand if he was being heard or not, and he would pray fervently. And at points he's praying to convince himself that he needs to be praying and he should be, and asking for faith. So when he talks about in the hymn, he relies on this metaphor of water, and I think he navigates it just expertly and beautifully. It's why it's touched me this many years later. But he talks about how, here he is, that the water is rolling around him. The tempest is getting higher around him. It's getting harder for him to have any hope in this moment.
Yeah.
And he's not even sure. He's praying, but in the middle of the hymn, he's not sure if God's hearing him. He expresses doubt. Is God even listening? And he's despaired. And I think the line of despair that always sticks in my mind is, lo, I sink, I faint, I fall. Because the waters are coming, I'm sinking. I'm losing all my nerve, and eventually I'm going to fall here. But there's a saving grace that happens, and something spiritually occurs in this moment. And instead of his continued fervent, I'm trying to pray, I'm trying to have hope, it's like God has reached his hand down, and what Charles does is realize, I've got to take his hand in faith. I've got to take it. It says he hopes against hope. And that's when he writes, dying, behold, I live. So it's like in a way, he succumbed to the tribulation, but in that succumbing to the suffering and giving his hand, taking Jesus' hand, he's going to live again. These concerns are killing me, right? They're tearing me down, but there's a hope that actually resurrects him. And that's when the water changes. So the beginning of the hymn, the water is the storm, and it's rolling around him. But then the water changes, and it becomes the healing stream of God, the river. It becomes the fountain of Jesus. It becomes springing up out of his heart. So the waters of suffering, of fear, of despair, those are converted into the waters of trust and hope and salvation and redemption. And I love it because you know what? He does not resolve this in some clear way. There is not a 3-step theological process for how this occurs, right? It just does. And he's articulating how this can be so. So I look at that and I see that represented in our present moment right now. I really do. There are these waters of suffering. There's economic hurt. There's fear about this virus. There's death all around us. Some of us have been touched personally by the death from this virus, but we're seeing death all around us. There's anxiety about what the government is and is not doing, and how can we rely on what they're doing. And I think in those sufferings, there is an opportunity for Christians, for ministry leaders, and for Christians who are just believing in Jesus and trusting. There's an opportunity for us to hope against hope. That though we feel like the waters are rolling, the waves are rising, that though we feel like we are sinking, fainting, falling, Christ is reaching his hand out amidst those waters of suffering. And he wants to lift our hope into waters of life. So I think that, like, coming out of this crisis, is if we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, or when that light shows up, when that light gets bigger, the church has an opportunity to turn the waters of suffering into the waters of hope, by reaching out to our neighbors in need, by providing economic relief where we can, where it's possible for us, by speaking Christ's peace to fear, grieving with those who've lost loved ones. That's so important. And I think ultimately trusting in the government that's on the shoulders of King Jesus. I mean, that he is Lord, not the government that we might have around us, but trusting on the government of Jesus as King. That's where I kind of like see this being an impactful cultural moment that we can see just by listening to Charles' words.
Yeah. I would add one more thing that maybe you've said it, but I want to say it even more clearly. One of the things that I think this hymn does for us is models the way that we can share the gospel. He shared the gospel in story, with a kind of vulnerability that there was a point where I was suffering even unto death, that I thought I was gonna lose it all, and yet the water that was terrifying became healing to me. And so probably the stories of our perseverance, our hope, the joy, the fellowship that we found with others during this time will be a part of what will be attractive. As we continue to express our fears and doubts, and we're expressing the waters that are going to kill us, that's not really attractive, I don't think, for us as a church. What we need to give are words of life, not words of fear. So how can we saved, transformed from the one who fears to the one who is loved, and who can give love to others?
Wow. That's great, guys. That is great. So enlightening and so hope-filled. I really appreciate you guys allowing me to have a front row seat to your discussion. Thank you so much.
I'm expecting to check in the mail, Joel. Just kidding.
Oh, Patrick, you're the best. I appreciate it. Dr. Eby, Pastor McFadden, it's a pleasure to see both of you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing what was in your heart with us today. Really appreciate that.
Thanks.
And for all of you watching, remember, we are Wesley, and you belong here. Blessings, health, and safety. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.